Okay, so I try to, come up with a short slide, just kind of express what I've been, thinking and doing with people. So this is really because part of my practicum is really exploring mental health and what it actually means in the eyes of, an African. Just to in terms of overarching thoughts about it. And then I try to explore some themes around, you know, uh, that individual interaction with mental health back home and in Canada, and what accounts for resilience or a lack of resilience, as the case may be. Just general themes around those. So yeah, so this is actually my interaction with Koi.
Okay, good afternoon.
Let me pause this. So I thought, in the spirit of, Siinqee, so I will play the greeting that Koi had when I talked with her. Just I thought it would be nice to start with that if Koi doesn't mind. Okay, it looks like she doesn't mind. I saw she put her head down, but I will just play this. Wait a second. Um, Here.
Other contexts of our life.
Great, thank you.
But I would start with Siinqee blessings.
Okay.
It's a call and response. So when I bless, you say hato. Hato. It means like amen, but may it be so. May it be so is what you say. So
Right, all right. Nice.
naganu fatao,
Hatao,
naganu fatao,
hatao,
nalalinu fatao,
hatao,
asaan keenya kan milkiinu fatao,
hatao,
asaan keenya kan wal hubannu nuuf haa ta'u,
hatao,
kan ittiin wal jabeessinu nuuf haa ta'u,
hatao,
haa milkoofnu haa ta'u,
hatao,
haa ta'u, haa ta'u.
hatao.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the greeting part. So we'll move to the actual conversation for today. So really, like I said, the context and background behind, my the reason I wanted to talk about this, I think it's maybe fair to say that I work in this space. So I work in mental health and addiction, primarily, and just by virtue of that interaction with people, and I have noticed that not a lot of our African folks are actually ending up in, because I work in like really acute care kind of setting. So people who have, you know, really broken down where they had to present to hospital, and then they're undergoing like intensive mental health supports. So I noticed, not a lot of our folks like Africans, which I haven't interacted with a lot of them. So I think that's where my thoughts, I started to wonder, are people not getting, don't they have mental health problems? How come I'm not seeing, how come they're not showing up here? Even if I know that, just like the slide says, Canada is admitting record number of immigrants actually, and including a very significant number from Africa, as per Statistics Canada figures. And Statistics Canada projects that immigrants are expected to make up about 30% of Canada's population by 2036. So if that is the case, what's happening in African spaces when it comes to mental health? And from my own lived experiences, being an African myself, I know that mental health sounds very different from back home versus in Canadian context. So I think that's where, that curious mindset came from. And this also speaks to the last slide. For example, the number of newly admitted immigrants who listed Nigeria as their place of birth in 2016 was 17,285. And in 2021, new immigrant numbers from Nigeria rose to 40,355. So just to give some kind of context, how much influx of immigrants are being admitted here into Canada, making Canada their new home. And another thing I noticed, because I try to look for research speaking to these topics. So considering this fact, it's really noteworthy that there is not a lot of research and data, speaking to, the state of African immigrants' mental health. And then, of course, the barriers to accessing culturally appropriate mental health in Canada continues to be under-researched. So there's really not a lot. I notice when I try to search for this data, I see a lot of outcome-related research. And when I say outcome-related research, so people who have actually got into the wrong side of mental health. So let's say, for example, people who now have involvement with children's services, overrepresentation of Black kids in care, Black kids struggling in school. So it's really outcome-based kind of research, wondering how did they end up here, or how has this become a problem? But there was really nothing speaking to what happens before that outcome in my eyes. I noticed there's not a lot that speaks to what does mental health even mean for Africans. In African context, I found that there's not a lot of research in that area, which kind of got me wondering as well. And let's go to the next. So in my mind, I thought that health-related policy making need to be research informed to reflect Canada's continuously changing ethnocultural landscape. Because we have, obviously, just by sheer numbers, the ethnocultural landscape is changing based on what the reports from Stats Canada is saying. It's only a matter of time where we need to start looking, okay, the demographics is not the same like it used to be. Are we considering these voices that are typically unheard? Because when just by virtue of my MSW studies, around policymaking and, those kinds of themes, policymaking can be very influenced by power dynamics as well, right? And if those in power and we know that those in power are really not Black people, so if they don't have that awareness around, policies that are actually culturally informed, research informed, to kind of reflect what the people actually need to thrive in society, it's gonna look like a one size fits just one, which I would say is not the way to go. So that's kind of where I am coming from with this. And I think it kind of ties to the next slide. So what is mental health actually? I try to look for different articles speaking to mental health and what it actually is. This particular definition I liked because it was very generic and it was one of the medical journals I found. So this person defined it as a state of balance within oneself and between oneself and one's physical and social environment. And then I try to understand from a medical kind of perspective, what is the background? So obviously psychiatry is, the field of medicine that caters for mental health. So psychiatry is a combination of two Greek words, psyche, which means mind or soul, and iatheria, which means healing. So I guess if you put it together, trying to heal the mind or heal the soul. Okay, and then understanding mental health from an African kind of perspective.
It's a really
Sorry, did I hear someone say something? Okay. Um, any questions so far? Okay, we'll talk about questions later. Okay, I'll just continue. So what is mental health as a concept from an African feminist perspective? And the reason I chose feminist perspective, of course, Siinqee is very feminist driven, so that's one reason. And also, I noticed personally, and this is an anecdotal kind of view, in by virtue of my work in mental health spaces, females appear to be overrepresented. So what does that mean? I find that it has been quite consistent in the last few years. I've been doing this, it's always maybe 60%, 70%, sometimes even 100% in terms of cohort numbers for those who are in treatment. And I think it kind of ties into some other research that kind of talks about, the disparity. Like men don't typically, seek mental health support, maybe because of the stigma. Oh, you're not strong, you need to be strong, you shouldn't voice your feelings are for the weak, those kinds of stereotype and narrative that I would say are unrealistic, because we're all human beings at the end of the day. We feel things and we go through stuff. However, I think maybe that has something to do with why females tend to be overrepresented. And I think there's actually, I found one research that spoke to, I think it's from the Canadian Mental Health Association, I think, for that research that spoke to, I think that the research was for 25 and under, and females were way overrepresented in that age bracket. So that's why I got interested to kind of hear from African women. Just what is your understanding of mental health, and what does it actually mean to you? So that would lead me. So this Tommy, Christabel, Ayan, they spoke to me. So the next video would be from 3 of them, and then we'll take it from there. So this is Tommy. Tommy is Nigerian, and she's just listen to the video, and then we can talk about it later.
What does mental health mean to you? So how do you even define it? Because I know from my own lived experience that mental health is not really a conversation that we usually have based on like in African kind of spaces. At least growing up, I never really had. There were no conversations around mental health. It was really physical health, maybe spiritual health. So from your understanding of mental health, having lived in Nigeria and moving to Canada like 5 years now, what does it mean to you?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And my mental health to me from an Afrocentric lens I would say mental health is something that is sacred. Like we don't talk about it. It's personal. We don't share it, right? And looking at it, it is something we experience that we are unable to describe, right? Because there are no conversation around it. First of all, mental health could mean, from an Afrocentric lens, could mean emotional health, psychological health. However, we do not have name for all these things. When you're feeling something, but you're unable to describe.
Yeah. So I will let you continue. I wanted to ask you. So you said something that caught my attention. So you said emotional and psychological. So those two words, where did they come from? Because you also said that we do not have words to describe it. So where did you get those two words to describe it today?
So this is my Canadian lens, right? So it's kind of like difficult to look at it from an Afrocentric point of view without not bringing the Canadian point of view, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of, I'm going to be mixing both, but I would be able to say this is Afrocentric, this is Canadian, right? So yeah. I would say that based on my own experience before coming to Canada, I would say mental health is something we do not discuss. We know there's something wrong. There's this feeling like we know there's something wrong. I'm moody. We can't name it, right? But we use our resilience, like we know we are going to get through this. Considering that from my own point of view, Afrocentric view, we are so spiritual. So we go to that spiritual lens to say, let me look up to God. I would feel better. Yeah. And it's been working rather than say, let me go to a therapist to talk about how I feel.
Yeah. So what does mental health even mean? What does it mean to you? When you hear the word mental health?
Well, for mental health for me means, what your well-being is like in terms of, being able to think clearly, being able to process things, clearly, just being able to feel okay, that everything is okay in your head, right? And how that's okay, how that feeling kind of interacts with every other thing that you do, right? Yeah, that's how I feel. What I feel mental health is like, because when you don't feel good in your head, when you don't feel okay in your head, right? It kind of flows out into everything else. It flows out into the way you talk. It flows out into, the way you see your environment, right? Your environment changes when your mental health is not good, right? Yeah. So mental health for me is, just being okay in the head, and how that feeling interacts with everything else around you.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a good way to capture it. However, I'm very curious as to, you said you've lived in Canada for about 10 years, and I'm assuming you came from Nigeria and you moved here from Nigeria. So this definition that you just provided, how did you come up with this knowledge, or this, how did you articulate this definition? Is it based on your Nigerian understanding of mental health, or Canadian, or a mixture of both?
I'm gonna go with a mixture of both, just because.
So, Ayan is an African, born in Toronto, who moved to Alberta later on in life, and who is currently living in Calgary. However, Ayan is very connected to her African roots, and she at least she told me she's very pumped to talk about this topic today. So I look forward to our conversations. So the next voice is going to be Ayan. So Ayan, I really want to ask you. So when you think about mental health and the whole conversation, which is quite a thing, I would say nowadays, there's lots of awareness compared to how it used to be. So what are your thoughts? How do people bounce back from mental health adversities in the eyes of an African? What does mental health even mean to you? Maybe we can start with that.
No, I was going to say thanks for having me, and yeah, I do find this topic interesting. Though I was born here, like my parents are Somali from Somaliland and Djibouti. So I kind of have, I guess, a dual kind of perspective on how I view mental health. But from an African, lens, I think mental health is, for me, the word that comes up a lot is community. I think of mental health as not just live like a distinct, like its own entity, but rather connected to other aspects of life. So, and other aspects of our wellness and our health. And I think of health as support, right? I think of health as like community support. So I guess my definition of mental health from an African Somali perspective would be kind of that combined support that one receives in order to feel mentally well and well in general. If that makes sense.
Oh yeah, it makes sense.
Okay, so those are just snippets from folks I talked to. So the next slide kind of speaks to, the role of ethnicity, race, and background, and how, how they can influence, mental health factors, which, then kind of shapes the next steps, right? What are we going to do with that, that reality that we have, right? So the first point there is just that our perception of mental health as a concept, and coping strategies foster to manage mental health. And I think that speaks to what those people I spoke to kind of highlighted. Just that perception of mental health as a concept. You need to believe that maybe there is something and something wrong before you can take that next step to say, okay, how can I, what can I do to kind of intervene? And I think it speaks to the next, how, whether, and where we want to seek help, right? And then if you think about seeking help, you think about the way we communicate verbally and non-verbally, and how Western health providers interact with us. Because, as Africans, we have our unique ways of doing things, just based on our culture. The way, for example, the way I show my affect is very unique to me and my culture. And I know in mental health spaces, affect is a big indicator as per DSM, diagnostic manual. The way someone presents when you do let's say you do a mental status exam, or MSE as we call it, affect is one of the indicators. And how do you tell from the affect of an African versus a Caucasian person what they are trying to communicate to you, for example, right? So that's something that can influence that interaction in health spaces. And of course, the nature and manner that our symptoms show up. So our symptoms show up differently, right? Just by virtue of being from a different race and from a different culture. So how do you account for that? And if you think about research, for example, if you think about the DSM, which is, from the American Psychiatric Association, it's a very Western document. And if you end up in hospital, that's what they're going to use to formulate a diagnosis for you, even if you are coming from a culture or a background that is very, very different from what is here, for example, right? So what accounts for that? Or how do you make up for that disparity? And then, of course, what kind of natural support network do we have and could we count upon, right? That was also a theme that kind of resonated, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And then our relationship with shame as an emotion, right? Shame that comes with seeking help, the stigma around mental illness. A lot of people, a theme that kept showing up is that I don't know if I can talk to someone about this, just because of that shame and the shame that comes with having a mental illness. So what is our relationship with shame? And shame is an emotion. And what is our relationship with shame? Okay. And then another thing that that ties to what I'm talking about, and something that I found in the research as well, just kind of speaks to the healthy immigrant effect. And the research shows that new immigrants upon arrival in Canada are reportedly healthier, especially the immigrants that show up based on economic immigration, because economic immigration in Canada, you need to do a medical exam, you need to pass the medical exam, those things. And in those medical exam, at least I know about it because I've had family members who have done it. They ask you things around your health history, even mental health. Have you had drug problems? Have you had addiction problems? Those kinds of things. So I would assume that if you pass the medical exam, that means you've not had those problems. So they come in generally healthy, in quote, especially the economic immigrants. And then the research also says there appears to be a decline in self-perceived mental health after migrating to Canada. So post-migration, mental health starts to, go towards the the wrong direction. So what is responsible for that, or what could be responsible for that? So based on my conversations and also read some research to kind of that spoke to this as well. There were these factors kind of came up post-migration. So loss of culture, so loss of identity that accompanies migrating to a new society, right? When you move from a culture that is so different to like Canada, which is very Western, that loss that comes with that, it takes a toll. It takes a toll. Of course, at first there's excitement, you move into a new place. However, over time, it takes a toll and you start to have that sense of loss. And that kind of showed up in my conversations with the respondents I spoke to. Another one was social isolation, difficulty navigating new and unfamiliar spaces. And, someone even said, I've left behind my family and friends. Having someone to listen to me would mean so much, right? Coming to this place, but it can be a challenge to get across to people here, and I think that ties around the other point on the right. Anti-Black racism is a real problem. That racial prejudice that comes with being Black, for example. People come see you with suspicion. Don't want to interact with you, talk to you at times just by virtue of your skin color, right? And one, in the mental health space, one illness or something that kept coming up, which is now being researched, is this risk-based traumatic stress. So I know Black psychologists, Black psychiatrists, like people who work in the mental health space, they've been pushing, kind of research and studies around the impact of race or racism on mental health and trauma. So I'm not going to go into any detail, but that is something that is a real thing, and it's really impacting. It has that potential to impact mental health and awareness for Black people. Economic factors. So, of course, therapy is expensive. Westernized therapy is not cheap. And we know that unemployment and underemployment is very prevalent among African communities. Another thing, there trust issues, fear of being misunderstood or judged. And someone even said, I might say something that triggers a meeting with children's services, right? So how do I know I can trust a white therapist when I'm sitting with them and talking about my personal stuff? Also, another thing that came up, lack of diversity amongst therapists. So can a white therapist understand, and make sense of what I'm trying to say, or make sense of my experience? And then social exclusion as well, red tapes and bureaucratic bottlenecks, continue to perpetuate that exclusion. Here, they tell you, you need to do credential assessment, you need to do this, you need to that. Lots of red tapes for immigrants when they show up here. And of course, over time, that takes a toll on their mental health as well. And then conversations around what has helped. These three themes kind of showed up in most of my conversations, which I'm still kind of unpacking. That sense of community, building a sense of community for self and participation in communal engagement activities seems to have helped people kind of recover, and it makes sense because I know back home, community is everything. I know, like, if I think about Nigeria, for example, lots of economic problems, hardship, and these kind of things. However, anytime I go home, people are still smiling, and I'm like, how are you guys smiling in this difficulty? It's really the community. Everyone is supports each other, takes care of each other, and it's something that's very unique. And folks, when they come here, they try to keep promoting that sense of community as much as they can. Another big factor that came up during conversation is that sense of spirituality, just that connection to Mother Nature, Earth, religion, God. And spirituality can mean different things to different people. However, whatever it means to you, that connection helps promote that resilience piece. And of course, connection itself, conversations around trips made back home to connect with family and friends. Some people said, I always make it a habit to go home once a year as much as I can. or if I cannot, I connect through social media, which is very common nowadays. I think it's one of the positives of social media, you know, being able to connect in real time to family back home. So this is the end of my presentation today. I really appreciate you taking time to listen to me.